صبروا يا باشا، بقول لكم ليش؟ كنتوا متأخرين ساعة. كنتوا متأخرين ساعة وشوية، ساعة و10 دقائق. والحين احنا بنخلص قبل الوقت إن شاء الله. Okay. Of course, one of the partners, I hope in the future, I hope will be EDB, inshallah. Okay. So for that we called Brother Simon from EDB, and he will give us a presentation about EDB. And there are lots of people, they want to meet you. They came from different countries, so they would like to see how they can invest in Bahrain later and so on. Okay. Some of them they work with us, some of them they came for the first time in Bahrain. So welcome, Brother Simon. You can come up, please, till I get your presentation, because I don't think they have it here already. Can you identify it? I think it's learning from economic challenges. Yeah, I think. Yes. 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 Yeah. So it's like. I'll use that.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to meet so many delegates, not only who are based in Bahrain, but who are visiting Bahrain from outside. Firstly, the scope of this conference is very interesting, and the inspiration economy is something that I think we all aspire to create here in Bahrain. But I wouldn't say this is necessarily a time of crisis. I think we're in a time of transition, a transition into a truly digital economy. And when you go through any significant transformation, there are going to be both winners and losers out of that transition. But overall, I am an optimist, and I believe that we're not in a state of crisis. We're in a stage of transition and revolution, if you like. A little bit about my organization. Bahrain's Economic Development Board, for those of you who don't know us, is a government-funded organization. It's chaired by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. And we have two main roles. The first role is really as a catalyst for economic change and reform, driving the economy away from being dependent on oil and gas and steering the economy into new dynamic sectors, new digital sectors. So to do that, we look at what regulatory reform, what new legislation we need to really make sure that Bahrain lives up to its business-friendly mantra. And then the second part of our role is much more hands-on. It's about identifying companies from around the world, attracting and then supporting them to set up here. To set up, and if they're already in Bahrain, to encourage them to grow and expand and upgrade their presence successfully here. And why do we do this? Fundamentally, we do this because we want to encourage businesses that have new technology, new products, new services, and that can create new jobs here in Bahrain. And increasingly, we're not just focusing on any employment, we're focusing on value-added employment, jobs that any Bahraini would aspire to do here in Bahrain. Now, whilst I say we're not in a state of crisis, there are certainly a number of headwinds, a number of challenges that we face when we want to develop the economy here in Bahrain. And probably the most important of those challenges is actually size. The fact that Bahrain is the smallest economy in this region, the only island economy in this region, means that we don't necessarily attract companies that are market seeking. But what I'd like to suggest to you that sometimes small is beautiful. Because what that means is that if you come and set up in Bahrain, or if you start a business in Bahrain, you have tremendous access. You have access to decision makers. And we've seen this with fintech companies that have tremendous access not just to the central bank of Bahrain, but to the governor of the central bank. And that he works in partnership with these startups and scale-ups to shape the regulatory landscape to accommodate new types of startups here in Bahrain. The form of access is access to investors. We have a tremendous concentration in a small space of high net worth individuals and family offices. So it's relatively easy for people to access potential investors here in Bahrain. And then, in addition to access to decision makers, you have access to consumers. Not only access to consumers here in Bahrain, but access to consumers in the largest economy in our region, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which we're connected to by a causeway. And there's probably no better place to access Saudi Arabia if you're not inside Saudi Arabia than being based here in Bahrain. So access is tremendously important for many businesses, whether you're a big multinational like Amazon Web Services or even a small startup. You can get access to people, products, services and finance in a way that you couldn't do in a much larger, more complicated country or economy. Now the other aspect to small is beautiful is the fact that increasingly at the EDB we focus on small companies. And a lot of people overlook small, high-growth companies when they want to attract foreign direct investment. The truth is, of course, that when we have over 1,000 investment promotion agencies, often they're all targeting the same Fortune 50 companies, and not all of them will be successful. But many of these investment promotion agencies at the national or subnational level are overlooking the medium high growth companies that they could attract to their economy. And I think that attracting small companies is very important. A, because you can easily reach the decision makers in small companies. B, because small companies, when you make a compelling proposition, can decide and act much faster than big companies. But also because if you attract a relatively small company to Bahrain, it won't crowd out the local companies. In fact, most smaller companies come with a view to partnering local companies or outsourcing much of their business activities to local service providers. So although they may not employ very many people directly at the outset, indirectly, because they're using local service providers, they're using local partners, they do create longer-term job opportunities. The next thing to say about smaller companies is that they don't have a huge global workforce. So when they do set up in Bahrain, even though they might send an expat to start with, very quickly they want to develop and nurture local talent so that they can really create a local pool, a local management team here in Bahrain. So don't overlook the smaller companies. And then within smaller companies, there is a subgroup of startup entrepreneurs and startup companies. And by startup companies, we don't just mean companies that have recently formed. We mean companies that are born global, companies that have a global perspective, companies that aim to scale and grow very rapidly. Whether they're homegrown Bahraini startups or scale-ups that we attract from elsewhere in the world, these businesses are not only going to look at the Bahrain market. They're going to start here, and then expand globally very quickly. So we think small is beautiful, both as a value proposition for Bahrain as an economy, but also in terms of the companies that we want to nurture and encourage to grow and expand. And the last thing I want to touch on here is the fact that for governments to grow a thriving startup ecosystem, this word ecosystem is quite important. And the reason it's important is that a startup ecosystem is very similar to a natural ecosystem. A natural ecosystem reflects the environment where it is located. And I believe a startup ecosystem is the same. Startups also have to relate and reflect the strengths and the opportunities in the economy where they're based. And that means that not everybody is going to be a Silicon Valley. Each city, each economy will develop a startup ecosystem in its own way. And the other point to make about ecosystems is that they're interrelated. So a startup ecosystem here in Bahrain needs to feed off and interact with other startup ecosystems elsewhere in the Gulf, elsewhere in the world. And it's all about balance. Easier said than done. But for governments, it's about making sure that the ecosystem grows quickly, is very dynamic, but that there is balance to that growth. So, for example, making sure you've got balance between support from the public sector and the private sector. Making sure that you've got finance for early stage startups, but also for scale-ups and larger companies. Getting the balance right between encouraging corporates to be involved and startups that want to engage with corporates. And finally, the balance between developing hardware in the form of having Amazon Web Services with a major data region here in Bahrain, or having 5G being rolled out across the country, to the soft infrastructure, revising the bankruptcy law, revising our many regulations that will encourage startup entrepreneurs. So ladies and gentlemen, if you're interested in talking to me about either setting up in Bahrain or how we could compare notes on growing the economy and particularly the startup ecosystem, I'd love to have a chat with you later on this afternoon. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Brother Simon. They were challenging me that I cannot stop EDB. And I don't like challenges like this usually. It's very difficult. I was sweating. Okay?
You can stop me.